Thank you so much for your kind introduction. And yeah, so as Hetty very kindly mentioned, I'm Sungik Yang. I'm a professor or assistant professor of history at ASU. And I focus on modern Korean history, but uh, oops, I focus on modern Korean history, but, uh-oh, technical difficulties. There we go. But I'm Within that focus, I specialize in political and intellectual history, and my current book project is, as Hetty mentioned, on the topic of fascism in Korea. So I'm writing this book, and I'll be drawing on a couple chapters. Chapter 2, which focuses on how Korean fascism arose after 1945, after Japanese colonial rule ended. But also I'll be drawing on the introduction where I try to situate the rise of Korean fascism within the larger scholarship and historiography of fascism as a whole. So some of the major questions I'd like to cover are as follows. First, to talk about Korean fascism, we have to understand what fascism is. And to understand what fascism is, it's useful to talk about the literature on fascism. Sorry. And then when looking at Korea, we have to understand how and why fascism arose in this historical context after 1945. So what was it about this post-liberation period after Japanese rule that was conducive for the rise of fascism? And then, of course, we have to know what was Korean fascism like, right? What were the ideas and ideologies behind Korean fascism? And finally, I'd like to conclude by talking about how Korea's case fits within this larger scholarship on fascism. So I think it's useful to talk about first, or to begin with, how this project got started, because then it kind of leads into talking about how I got interested in this, but also how my thinking about Korean fascism evolved over time. So when I was a first year in the Ph.D., I was feeling a bit lost because I realized I wasn't quite interested in the topic I had proposed in my application. Um, so my advisor, the late great Carter Eckert, he said, I have this book I'm reading, or I know this person that's connected to Park Jang-hee, who he was researching at the time, that you might, whose works you might find interesting. So let's read a book together. So in that first year, we did a small reading group for this one book, and it's by this man called Park Sang-gil, who ended up becoming Park Jang-hee's spokesperson for a few years in the 1960s. But in 1948, he published this book called 우주탄 선언, or A Declaration to Shake the Universe, is how I translated it. And while the book itself was very boring and very tedious to read, the ideas contained in it I thought were quite interesting when thinking about the historical situation of Korea, because in 1948, when it was published, South Korea was established. So this was published after the creation of South Korea as a state. And yet in this book, he was talking about how Korea should find a different path from communism and capitalism, and by extension, find perhaps a different path away from the Soviet Union, but also the United States. And this book was actually endorsed by a lot of heavyweights in Korean politics at the time. Syngman Rhee, the president, but also nationalist leaders like Kim Gu, Kim Gyu-sik, An Jae-hong. So clearly, it resonated with even members of the top political class in South Korea, despite the fact that South Korea was aligned with America diplomatically, and yet these ideas were emphasizing a sort of third way beyond both sides. And what Park Sang-gil was emphasizing was finding a third way beyond capitalism and communism, beyond the Soviet Union and the United States, on behalf of the Korean nation ultimately. So I thought, well, this is quite interesting to see this sort of book being endorsed by these people. I'll see if this is an outlier or if there's more to this. And the more I dug into the discourses of this time period, I found that it was definitely not the only such work. And in fact, there was a perhaps even more paradigmatic framework called the One People Principle, or 일민주의, that actually was adopted as the first state doctrine of the Rhee regime, that went perhaps even further into these themes of nationalism and third way politics, which I recognized as hallmarks of fascism, from what I had learned, at least at the undergraduate level, it was also very heavily collectivistic, talking about the need for the individual to sacrifice themselves on behalf of the nation and state. So this felt okay. This sounds very fascist, but I realized I needed to get a better grounding in the literature on fascism. So I had to start answering this question for myself too. What is fascism anyway? And obviously, for most people around the world, the common images of fascism have to do with the historical movements in Italy and Germany, like the Nazi Party, and of course, Mussolini, Hitler, the fascist leaders. But what about the belief system of fascism, right? Because I was dealing with ideas here that I thought were fascist. So I had to understand better what fascist ideas were and what fascist ideology was as well, if there is such a thing. And actually, that was pretty controversial early in the scholarship of fascism because most scholars or most interpretations that had credence in the world discounted ideology in favor of interpreting fascism as a form of class politics, namely that of the bourgeoisie in the communist case. So for the Comintern or the Communist International, they defined fascism in the 1930s as basically capitalism's last gasp to save itself, right? So capitalism had originally relied on liberal democracy as a way to perpetuate itself. But in the 1920s and 30s, there was a crisis of democracy and liberalism. And so liberal democracy was no longer sufficient. It was under threat by the wave of communist revolutions that were spreading first from Russia into elsewhere in the world. So capitalism turned to mobilizing non-workers, the non-proletariat, like the petty bourgeoisie and the peasantry, to shore up its support base and fight back against revolution. And so fascism was this last chance of fascism to save itself once democracy was no longer working. So that was one form of interpretation of fascism as class politics. And there were also social scientists in America like Seymour Martin Lipset that talked about fascism as a form of middle class extremism, looking at arguing that most of the supporters of fascism were from the middle class. So he had a different interpretation than the Marxists and communists in what fascism was about. But at the core, his core premise was that it was also a form of class politics. But then in the 1970s, we see a turn in the literature on fascism in emphasizing ideology and taking its intellectual history seriously. So there are many, many scholars who contributed to what is now called generic fascism, this generic fascism framework. But some of the key folks I want to mention include Eugene Weber, Stanley Payne, Roger Eatwell, Zev Sternel, Roger Griffin, and Robert Paxton. They contributed a lot of core ideas to the generic fascism framework. And so when we look at the typology of fascism, oftentimes divided into regime, movement, and ideology, it was these bottom two, fascism as movement, fascism as ideology, that was the focus of generic fascism, and especially fascism as ideology. And so what these scholars of generic fascism ended up defining fascism as were as follows. So, of course, some scholars emphasize different things, but I think collectively we can talk about generic fascism as indicating these core themes. First, a palingenetic form and revolutionary form of ultranationalism. And here, palingenetic means national rebirth or renewal. So, for example, if we take the phrase, make America great again, I think there's a palingenetic focus there because what it's talking about is not just that the nation needs to be restored from it to its former glories in a time where it's sunk, it's being victimized, but it also uses the past as a model for the present and future. So that's palingenetic and revolutionary form of nationalism. And the nationalism is also a very organic form of nationalism, which talks about the nation as an organism, almost as its own sort of living entity. It's not just a collection of individuals, but it's its own organic being. And also there is this focus on the idea as a pure nation. There are many nations in the world, but our nation is unique in its purity. And that sort of rhetoric was rampant in fascist ideologies and movements around the world. And fascism is also considered in this model as a third way form of politics that's neither right nor left, as Sterno talked about in his book. It's an explicit rejection of left and right, as well as a rejection of communism and capitalism and liberalism. It's presenting itself as an alternative to both major frameworks. And so this third wave form of politics, I think, is crucial to understanding fascism's ideology, but also its appeal. Because even today, we can see the appeal of ideas or people who seem to represent a, a reaction against the status quo, but claim to neither be left or right. And the early fascists also gained popularity through this framing of themselves as this third way form of politics. So naturally, because they're a third way form of politics, they are very anti-communist, which has often been highlighted in histories of fascism, but also very heavily anti-liberal, which I think has been a bit underrated. This includes fascism being anti-capitalist. Now, once in power, many of the fascist regime, or the two major fascist regimes that are known in Italy and Germany, cooperated heavily with the bourgeoisie, with capitalists. But in terms of their rhetoric, they were anti-capitalist, and that is partly why they gained so many followers in the 20s and 30s, because capitalism was undergoing a crisis. People didn't like it, and they thought fascism might be one way to resolve this crisis, one way or the other. And anti-liberalism also includes a collectivistic bent in understanding individual society relations. You are not your own individual. You cannot live outside of the nation. A common metaphor was that individuals are like cells or limbs of a body, the collective body of the nation. Can a cell or a foot or an arm exist by itself without the body? So likewise, can an individual live outside of the nation and state? So a very collectivistic orientation in fascism. So there are other aspects of generic fascism you could talk about, but these are, I think, the core ideas I'd like to highlight. So when going back to what was happening in Korea, I couldn't help but think, yeah, actually, it tracks. So my original hypothesis seems to hold here, and we can talk about fascistic strains of thought in Korea after 1945. It was heavily nationalistic and ethno-nationalist. It was very collectivistic. There are constant declamations against the individual being its own discrete entity. And there was a heavy emphasis on overcoming left and right. And this was as the Cold War was beginning. So that sort of rhetoric gained a lot of credence at the time, as I'll talk about in a bit. I think it might be useful, though, to first think about how, like, what are the roots of fascism such that it had these expressions after 1945? So what was the sort of prehistory of Korean fascism? It really boils down to what was happening in the 4 decades prior during the colonial period and the setting in which Korean nationalism arose and how Koreans were being exposed to Japanese anti-Western ideas and how it all kind of combined to then form this fascistic discourse after 1945. So ethnic nationalism, I mean, there are many debates about when Korean nationalism really arose. Some point, some Korean nationalists talk about how the nation existed since primordial times. And even some scholars of Korea have talked about a sense of identity, maybe a Korean form of identity arising, even as early as the Japanese invasions of Korea in 1592. There being a proto-nationalism that was based on the fact that Korea was a united polity with a fairly common language and culture for hundreds and hundreds of years. But I think most scholars now agree that modern Korean nationalism as a phenomenon really arose in the late 19th century and early 20th century as a reaction against the threat to national sovereignty in that time period when the kingdom of Joseon was being beset on all sides by foreign threats from the Japanese and European powers. And so Korean intellectuals like the historian Shin Se-ho thought, well, okay, we need to figure out a way to keep our nation independent. And one of the ways to do so is to make sure that Koreans have a firm sense of self. Who are we? And why are we different and better than other people, especially those who are trying to take us over? And that's where ideas of Korean ethnic nationhood really arise. And that's where this emphasis on ethnic purity also arise, right? Because you have to emphasize that Koreans are different and better, to make sure that Koreans feel pride in themselves and are willing to defend themselves against foreign threats. Um, now, now, blood is not originally a main focus of ethnic nationalism. It's not until, say, the 30s that you really see the emphasis on blood. But soon after that idea is introduced, it takes hold among Koreans during the colonial period, especially since that is when the assimilation policies of Japan really ramp up, and some Korean nationalists say, okay, we need to figure out how to really differentiate ourselves from the Japanese when they're trying to assimilate us into Japan. But once that happens, this idea of Koreans' blood purity also becomes a common phenomenon in nationalist discourse in this time. Now, because they're facing a foreign threat, you can't afford division within the nation, right? If Koreans are pursuing their own self-interest, or if they're being divided along the lines of social class, or if they're being tempted by revolution, like class-based revolution, as we see in Russia and elsewhere in the world, the Korean nation there will be so many rifts that there will be no ability to take united action. So there's an inherent built-in collectivist orientation in Korean nationalism, because in order for the Koreans to achieve independence, once the Japanese take it over, you have to have a united front. You cannot let individualism or class-based identity supersede that of the nation. And this is also the time when social Darwinist thought is popular in Korea as elsewhere in East Asia. And this idea of the nation as an organism also becomes basically commonsensical by that point. So the individual becomes separate from the nation. And so you have the social Darwinist influence, you have the impulse to unite based on this external threat. So there is this collectivist orientation in Korean nationalism from the beginning. And ideas like, oh, you need to sacrifice your individual lesser self on behalf of the national greater self, right? This, greater than you, both in terms of size, but also in importance, right? That is an idea that Shin Se-ho popularized in his writings, and also becomes quite common in Korean nationalism henceforth. You see it quite a lot in South Korean ideological documents after 1945 as well. But in addition to Korean nationalism, there's also the influence of Japanese anti-Westernism. So in Japan, in the pre-war period, especially once the wartime period begins in 1937, we see Japanese ideology really focus on how Western ideas like individualism and liberalism and materialism are corrupting Japanese society, and there's a need to revert to native tradition, however defined, and try their best to remember what the Japanese way of life and thinking were, and we need to return to that way of thinking and living. So you had propaganda that talked about you need to get the dandruff of liberalism and individualism and so forth out of your hair. You need to purify yourself as a Japanese. And so in one sense, it was a very nationalist discourse. But the way the Japanese also framed this was that it's not just about Japan versus the West, it's also East versus West, because Japan is not just its own country, but it's part of this Asian community. It's part of a racial community of the yellow race, so-called yellow race versus the white race. And so this anti-Westernism was tied to a pan-Asian framing of things. And the Japanese were kind of setting themselves up as the leader of a pan-Asian union. That's where ideas like the Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere originate. And Koreans, even though many disliked Japan or hated Japan, they actually found common ground here that, yeah, actually, ideas like the individual, systems like capitalism are not native to Korea or Asia. And for Korean tradition as well, these are harmful, and we need to do our best to excise it from our national community. Now, both Koreans and Japanese realize just how deeply embedded capitalism had become in their way of life. Even the most fervent of Japanese propagandists were sort of despairing about, is it ever possible to wean Japanese off of capitalist modernity? But still, you need to try your best. And so you had this pervasive anti-Western discourse throughout the Japanese Empire, of which Korea had become, of course, by 1910. And again, there were some sympathies that Korean intellectuals had, even nationalist ones who were anti-Japanese, about the corrosive influence of the West onto Korea. And these ideas stuck around even after liberation in 1945. And finally, in the colonial era, there was Korean awareness of what was happening in Europe at the time. They knew that Germany had come under the control of Hitler. They knew about fascist Italy, and many of them actually liked what they saw. And today, of course, fascism, Nazism, there's obviously a very negative stigma around them. But this time before World War II, before knowledge of the Holocaust had spread, it to many people, not just in Korea but around the world, it seemed like fascism was an exciting alternative to all the chaos they had been witnessing in the 1920s and 30s. They saw Mussolini and Hitler as strong leaders to emulate. Uh, a common phrase was, I think Mussolini was someone who made the trains run on time, right? At least they get things done. Now, of course, new research has shown that actually this is not really the case. They were just as chaotic in their rule as the previous liberal democratic forms were. But the stereotype or the image of fascism in the 20s and 30s was that they have strong leadership, and that's what's needed in this time of chaos. And for Koreans, they were also admiring of Mussolini and Hitler's elevation of the nation and state as supreme. And so you even had students writing essays like, I revere Hitler in Korean language publications in the 1930s. And some Korean nationalists, even the anti-Japanese ones, saw Hitler and Mussolini as role models for Korean nationalists. They needed strong leadership within the nationalist movement to push their movement to success. So the popularity and understanding of fascism and fascist ideas has to also be taken into account when thinking about these sort of roots and origins of Korean fascism. But it's in the post-liberation space after 1945 that these ideas sort of congeal and become truly powerful, partly because that's when Korean nationalism can finally be fully expressed. It's no longer under the censorship and control of the Japanese. But also it's the uniqueness of this post-liberation period has to be taken into account. So the liberation space is what's often it's the label that's often applied to this post-1945 to about 1948, 1950 period. It's obviously referring to the first few years of liberation from Japanese rule, but I think it's also very appropriate because it's a time of intellectual liberation. Right? This is before South and North Korea are formally established as separate countries. It seems like the possibility is bright for Korea. Anything is possible for Korea. Koreans are rushing to publish their ideas and proposals for how Korea's future should be, and anything is on the table, or maybe nothing's off the table is a better phrase to use. Whether it's communism, capitalism, liberalism, whatever works for Korea should be adopted. It's the sort of approach that many Koreans take. But sort of paradoxically, it is that very intellectual diversity that I think helps to explain how fascism arose, because it works in conjunction with another key feature of this era, which is that it was a time of crisis. And there are many crises, like the economic crisis that South Koreans faced, soaring rice prices and so forth. But it was in terms of politics and the intellectual sphere, it was, I think, this crisis of division that defined the era, and namely the crises, the interrelated crises of national division, the Cold War, and political polarization. And it's the conjunction of this intellectual ferment and this period of crisis that makes this post-liberation era conducive for the rise of fascistic thought. So Korea obviously was facing the crisis of national division because it was divided into North and South by the incoming Americans and Soviets who initially said, we'll just have a temporary division of Korea to manage the transition from Japanese colonial rule to independence. But then, as their relations deteriorated, as soon as World War II was over, this temporary division became a permanent one. And to Koreans, this was very unnatural to them because for 1,000 years they had lived under one polity, right? Maybe different dynasties governing the peninsula, but overall they understood Korea as one entity that maybe changed rules, but it was still one Korea. So the Korean intellectuals and politicians were scrambling to figure out how to resolve this unnatural phenomenon of division. And division was also connected to the Cold War because it was caused by the fact that the superpowers of the Soviet Union, the United States, were managing affairs in both zones, and they just could not come to any sort of agreement. Their superpower rivalry was directly causing Korea to be divided. And not only that, they had their militaries in Korea. They had armed forces in North and South Korea. So if Soviet-American relations deteriorated to a point that they were going to fight a war, Korea was right in the crossfire. And if you look at the political discourse at the time, there's constant fears of World War III breaking out, and the recognition that Korea could easily be a tinderbox or powder keg that initiates that conflict. And not only initiates it, but gets victimized heavily. Because if World War III were to break out, and especially since the US now had atomic weapons and the Soviets would soon follow by 1949, Korea could just be ground into dust in that scenario. So the fears of war were very real at the time because of the Cold War rivalry. And related to this Cold War rivalry was immense political polarization and violence, especially in South Korea during this time. You had left and right aligned or sympathetic to the Soviet Union, America, communism, etc. You had all these political factions arise that just could not come to terms with each other and saw each other as mortal enemies. And so you had paramilitary youth groups fighting each other on the streets every day, very reminiscent of what was happening in Europe after World War I when right-wing groups and communist groups fought, and eventually some of those groups turned into fascist groups. But you also had a rash of assassinations of many top Korean leaders. And so Koreans were feeling like the whole country was descending into chaos. The world was potentially going to descend into chaos. Our country is divided. What do we do? It was a time of crisis. And so what arose then was this movement to create new philosophies, so-called new philosophies that were going to resolve these crises of division. And the main solution that they came up with was that Korea needs to be united, both in terms of the peninsula, north and south, but also internally, there needs to be a total national solidarity so that we can resolve this crisis together, overcome the crisis of national division. And then there was the thought that by resolving Korean unification, then maybe the American-Soviet relations can also be resolved, or at the very least, you can push them out of the peninsula so that Korea is no longer going to be pulverized in a potential World War III. And so you have writers, including Park Sang-gil, but all other writers, for example, this guy called Ju Dae-byuk, who wrote a book that's literally titled Dae-byuk's Declaration. It's like if I were to write Sungik's Declaration, right? Like you have Ujutan Sanan, Dae-byuk Sanan, published in the same year, 1948, offering very similar solutions. And they call themselves new philosophies, but the way they were the solution that they were offering was basically, hey, the Cold War is a conflict between capitalism and communism, or materialism and idealism. I have a brilliant solution to this. Why don't we combine the two? And that's your new philosophy right there. And that's that's basically what both of these writers and other writers of the time were thinking. Just take the good from these rival ideologies and make a better ideology from those pieces. Not very original, but you can kind of see where the appeal lay when thinking about how division was the key theme of Korean politics at the time. And it was this idea that really struck me when reading Ujutan's Hanan. And these diagrams, I think, do a great job in showing what Park Sang-gil was talking about and how other Koreans at the time thought of things too. So in the left-hand diagram, you see how he's conceiving of his new philosophy. Let's just take all the ideologies out there, just combine them together into one. So let's throw all the and remember it's the good aspects, not the bad aspects, the good aspects of things like democracy, communism, nationalism, socialism, statism, totalitarianism. Let's throw in the three principles of the people by Sun Yat-sen there too. Let's combine it all into a new philosophy that will guide Korea and the world to resolving these crises of division. And then the second image is also very important because it shows how he's positioning his thought in relation to others. In this diagram, he puts his new ideology above left and right. And this positioning above is very important. So if you look at the diagram, between the Chinese characters for left and right, you see 중간 or middle. He's not, when he's rejecting communism and capitalism, when he's talking about a third way, he's not talking about a centrist or moderate political ideology. He's overcoming left and right. He's transcending left and right with this new ideology, which is a way of thinking that I think was emblematic of nationalist thinking at the time. And that's why I have labeled this form of nationalism as transcendent nationalism. So that's my coinage. So there wasn't any Korean writer explicitly talking about, a transcendent nationalism. It's my sort of artificial framing of this. But I do think it holds it's useful in understanding how Koreans thought about things at the time. So this when they're thinking about the Korean nation, they're saying that it needs to transcend multiple things. First, left and right, as I mentioned, this communism and capitalism divide, but it's also about the nation transcending other things like the individual and class. So if you are individualistic, or if you're adhering to a class-based identity, like I'm part of the proletariat or I'm part of the bourgeoisie, you're undercutting the nation and you're hurting the efforts at uniting the nation to face these crises. So you need to transcend the individual, class, left, right, and so forth. It's the Korean nation's identity and interests that are supreme, not anything else. I think the most representative example of this transcendent nationalism was this aforementioned one people principle, or 일민주의. So it's this, it was actually, Syngman Rhee himself in one of his writings talked about the one people principle as the state doctrine, or 국시. But while he was an important early contributor, there were other contributors to this framing, to this framework. So you have the educator and philosopher An Ho-sang on the bottom left, and you have the journalist Yang Woo-jung on the bottom right, who are also primary authors of this philosophy or this ideology. And when you look at the contents, even more so than Park Sang-gil's book, you really see what you could argue as fascistic themes emerging. And that's why several Korean scholars have actually called 일민주의 as, quote, Korean style fascism. So these are some of the texts that are central to understanding the one people principle, written by Rhee, An, and Yang. And their ideas are fairly simple, I think, in many ways. I think this diagram actually does a good job in showing the core themes, which is that under this supreme ideology of the one people principle, you have a nation united by one bloodline, united in one destiny. And then you have all these other subtopics, like things like, equality across genders, status, regions, and so forth. And here you also see that, but in writing. So in this simple diagram of the one people principle, the core themes of supreme loyalty to the nation, to the fatherland, but also not having any inequality in terms of gender, social status, class, region, and so forth, right? That's contained in this diagram, and it does a good job in summarizing what the ideology is all about. Now, you might look at this emphasis on equality and say, "Oh, well, it seems kind of socialistic in some ways," and there were some folks in this group promoting 일민주의 like Yang Woo-jung that were former socialists that had those influences from, say, even Marxism. But when we really look at what sort of equality that 일민주의 is talking about, we can understand it less as a form of class liberation and more as a form of national homogeneity. Because if you have differences across genders and regions, social status, it's going to invite resentment based on those differences. It's going to divide the nation. But the one people develops from one bloodline and one destiny, and they have to have the same actions and same thoughts. If you have these class-based, status-based divisions, that's not going to hold. Well, what is emphasized thus is homogeneity or 동일성 and unity or 통일성, and those are the position and purpose of the one people principle, according to An Ho-sang. So equality is not so much about, making sure that, say, the proletariat and bourgeoisie are, living well. It's more that they're living well together under the aegis of the nation. It's just erasing any form of difference to promote this homogeneity so that you can promote national unity, which is really the supreme goal of 일민주의. And some other quotes that really show this emphasis on the supremacy of the nation state and national unity. You have An Ho-sang talking about how the nation is more precious than any individual or class, and the state is larger than any group or political party. And to consider the nation and state as the highest or most precious entity is the nature of life and the main duty of the one people. And then Syngman Rhee, in his own contribution, his frequently repeating vocabulary is centered on oneness. Our nation is one, the national territory is one, our spirit is one, so forth. So again, it's about homogeneity, it's about unity, erasing differences. It's coming at equality from a very nationalist angle. Because of the supremacy of the nation, it relates to their twin anti-communist and anti-capitalist, anti-liberal stances. They openly talk about how communism is the enemy of humanity, but also that capitalism is not compatible with the one people principle. So the basic premises behind this, again, centered on the nation. So if you have communism that promotes class politics and thus class conflict, you're going to have Korean bourgeois people, Korean proletariat fight against each other. That's not going to promote national unity, is it? And then capitalism, first, it promotes class conflict because of its promotion of socioeconomic inequality. There's going to be winners and losers under capitalism. So you're naturally going to invite this inequality that communism reacts against. So one point of angle of attack of capitalism is based on those same class politics, but also capitalism is about the selfish pursuit of self-interest, which means that some Koreans may sell out the nation for their own personal benefit, for their own profit. They prioritize their selfish interests instead of the nation's interests. So that's another reason why capitalism was attacked. It's a promotion of individualism. And so there is this very collectivistic third way style of thinking in 일민주의. And one interesting way in which it's expressed is also in how they describe and talk about the democracy that is suitable for Korea. So there's a phrase, Korean-style democracy, that becomes quite infamous under Park Chung-hee, the later dictator of South Korea. He uses this phrase to justify his authoritarianism, talking about how his style of illiberal politics is what's suitable for Korea. It's a sort of justification for his authoritarianism. But we still see precursors to Korean-style democracy in this idea of Silla-style democracy that An Ho-sang especially was promoting heavily. So his premise about Korean-style democracy is that Koreans, they didn't have the tradition of Western liberalism as Europe and America did. Their fundamental ideas about what society, individual relations are like are very divergent. If we look back to the past, to this ancient kingdom of Silla and its institutions of the Hwarangdo and Hwabaek, we can find a model for an actual Korean-style democracy that fits Korea's condition in this time. So the Hwarangdo were, to generalize and oversimplify, it was a group of mainly aristocratic youths who were trained in literature, but also martial arts, and many Hwarang actually became prominent soldiers and generals in the Silla armies who led Silla's unification of the peninsula in the 600s. And the Hwarangdo by this time had been understood as a very selfless, self-sacrificial group who always cooperated with each other and always did what was best for their country, which is how Silla was able to emerge as the main power on the peninsula. And An Hosang said this is actually a very democratic way of behavior. Another institution that he emphasized was the Hwabek, which was a sort of aristocratic governing council which worked with the king to make policy decisions. And a unique feature of the Hwabek Council was that all decisions had to be unanimous. There could be no disagreement, even from one person, or else you can't make these decisions. But he saw this focus on unanimity, an ideal way of making these policy decisions. And so basically, that means that you discourage things like partisan conflict, but also pluralism or the diversity of thought, right? You need to have a unity of thought to be able to be unanimous in your decision making. But he didn't see this as conflicting with democracy, and in fact saw it as core to what was appropriate for Korea. So Korean-style democracy to An Hosang was a form of politics that emphasized that everyone should sacrifice themselves for the greater good, and that everyone should have unity of thought, no dissent whatsoever. Now, for those in the Western liberal tradition, that might sound very anti-democratic, but that was An Hosang's view of how democracy should be for Korea based on its history and traditions. So if we are to summarize what the One People Principle is about, it's based on these themes of ethnic nationalism, the supremacy of the nation, this palingenetic focus on the nation's past as a model for the future, the focus on unity, a constant theme in Irminjuri, and this rejection of capitalism, liberalism, and communism, which part of which included a very collectivistic bent in subordinating the individual to the nation and state, criticizing capitalism's promotion of selfishness, and communism's promotion of class politics. There was also an attempted cult of personality of Syngman Rhee, as you can see in this image, right, talking about Syngman Rhee as the originator of this thought and so forth. So we can see maybe parallels to fascist cults of personality, but this effort sort of fizzled out. They could never really make it stick, but it was an early part of the push behind Irminjuri. But I think more important about, or what's important about Irminjuri is not so much its role as a sort of fountainhead of ideas. And in fact, Irminjuri, even though it was declared the state doctrine in 1949, it was soon abandoned by 1953, and you can't really see references to it after that point in state media and state talking points. But I still think it's important to mention because it's a clear product of the times. So the ideas in Irminjuri were very convergent with pre-existing ideas that were circulating in South Korea and South Korean society. These same ideas about ethnic nationalism, blood-based nationalism, palingenetic interpretations of Korean history, and then of course anti-communism and anti-liberalism were shared across the intellectuals in Korea and politicians too. And even if the One People Principle fizzled out, these same ideas that Irminjuri promoted remained in Korean political discourse for decades and decades until about the 1980s. And even then, you still see some ideas live on. And so what I want to emphasize about transcendent nationalism is not just the content of its ideas, but the fact that it had a sort of hegemonic hold over South Korea throughout this authoritarian period. So on one hand, state ideology was drawing on ideas already existing in South Korea. But once South Korea was established in 1948 and it began to establish ideological institutions, you see that hegemony perpetuate because of how the state controls public opinion through things like mass education, the military and its ideological training or moral education system, its censorship of mass media, and cultivation of relations with academic historiography. And through these institutions, which I call the state ideological complex, they were able to keep transcendent nationalism in this hegemonic position because now it's tied to the state and state ideology, even beyond 일민주의. And I began talking about this project by mentioning how it started with my advisor working on Park Chung-hee and connecting me or introducing me to a text written by someone connected to Park Chung-hee. It's not a coincidence. Park Chung-hee, I think his regime established, or maybe his regime represented the peak of transcendent nationalism, because under his government, ideology was much more systematic than even under WWII. And you see the constant stream of the same ideas of transcendent nationalism circulating all over South Korean society throughout the 60s and especially the 1970s. So it's under Park Chung-hee that we really see transcendent nationalism permeate almost all aspects of Korean thought at the time. But I'm not going to go too much. I'm not going to go into Park Chung-hee for this talk. There's not enough time. I'm happy to talk more about it in Q&A if you're interested. But transcendent nationalism, I think, was very durable as a framework. When we look at these ideas, I think we can hopefully agree that many of them are at least fascistic or strongly fascistic, even if one might not be ready to call this fascism. There are strong convergences with what was proposed in the generic fascism model. At least that's my argument. But when I was doing this research, I couldn't help but realize that the rest of the scholarship on fascism might not be so ready to call this fascism, because despite the name of generic fascism, many scholars were not ready to really apply it in a generic way. So one example is this historian, Stanley Payne, who was a very important contributor to this generic fascism model. He wrote this book called Fascism, Comparison and Definition, which attempted to outline what fascism was all about. And one of the subchapters was literally titled Generic Fascism, a Uniquely European Phenomenon, which is a very oxymoronic statement to me. How can it be generic if it's a uniquely European phenomenon? So generic fascism had arisen as a sort of Weberian ideal type model that would be useful for comparison, comparative analysis. But these historians and political scientists who created this model were still focused on comparing regimes and movements and ideologies within Europe and not beyond it. And the logic was that characteristics of European fascism could not be reproduced on a significant scale outside Europe. And it's the European fascistic characteristics that often define generic fascism. Now, this sounds like a very circular logical argument, and other scholars have talked about how it amounts to tautology, right? How can you have the replication of European historical phenomena outside Europe, since like places like Asia have had different historical experiences, right? So there is this circular logic operating in talking about generic fascism as uniquely European, and it took many years. It's only recently that we finally see a turn towards a more expansive application of fascism, I think. But for many years, it created this sort of feedback loop where any case outside of Europe was dismissed as a form of fascism. So you have this initial argument that fascism is not possible outside Europe like in Asia. And then you have historians of Asia, like historians of Japan, Imperial Japan, look at that literature and say, well, they say it's not fascist. And yeah, based on their criteria, which are heavily based on the European historical experience, Japan doesn't fit this. So of course, we can agree that Japan, Imperial Japan, was not fascist. And then you have later scholars of fascism say, hey, look, those scholars of Japan said it was not fascist. So of course, we have to rely on their word and conclude the same, that we don't see fascism outside of Europe like in Asia. So, and I have to make a caveat here, though, that it's the English language scholarship that's arguing this. So you have, say, Japanese historians very readily admitting or arguing that Imperial Japan was fascist. But in the English language scholarship, it was very much caught in this sort of feedback loop for many decades. But thankfully, these are some examples of the earlier literature on Japan that talked about how fascism is not applicable to this time. But thankfully, in recent years, I think things have changed. So you have a recent scholarship showing how Asia, like Japan, and also China, were very much integrated into this global fascist discourse um, that that was very visible throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And even if Japan or China were not fascist regimes per se, and even in the European scholarship, it's hard to identify a fascist regime because there have just been so few examples, and some disagree whether even Italy or Germany were fascist. So, but even if Japan was not fascist or Kuomintang China was not fascist, at the very least we can acknowledge that it was embedded in this global discourse on fascism. The Japanese, the Koreans, Chinese, as I mentioned before, very aware of what was happening in Europe. Hitler, Mussolini, popular figures all across Asia and the world. And you had Japanese right-wing figures and intellectuals even criticize European fascism for basically not being fascist enough for Japan. They're using that argument that what's happening in Europe is not applicable to Japan, but they still wanted a fascistic style of government for their own countries. But you see this engagement with fascism in Japan and elsewhere in Asia. It's I think now impossible to deny this, that fascist movements and ideas were very much in circulation across Asia. So then, where does this leave Korea, and what contributions does Korea make to our understanding of fascism? Well, so first, it offers another non-Western and Asian case of fascist ideologies. And I think in that sense, it's already a significant contribution on its own. But also, it's the fact that Korea is a post-colonial case of fascism. That, I think, is really where the Korean case stands out. And when we think about fascism, it's the aggressive expansionist nationalism of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan that stand out, and that's how fascism is defined usually. So one might ask, how does an anti-colonial nationalism that Korean nationalism was, how does that turn fascist? One thing to remember about how the Germans and Italians and Japanese framed themselves, though, was their nationalisms were based on a somewhat similar premise of victimhood and grievance. So, of course, they were not colonized by other powers, but they felt a lot of resentment against what was happening elsewhere in the world because they had to play catch up in industrialization, but also imperialism, right? They were losing out because they started out too late in the game. And so you had all these other countries like Britain and America and France and later America become more powerful and great imperial powers by the time of the late 19th century, when Germany, Italy, and Japan had really begun their own process of industrialization. So you had Germans, Italians, and Japanese all call themselves basically as proletarian countries vis-a-vis the bourgeois countries of the West, like Great Britain and France and America. Now, again, this is in many ways substantially different from what other anti-colonial nationalisms are based on, which is outright colonization, right? But you still have this kernel similarity based on the sense of grievance and victimhood, which you could see maybe germinate into a more aggressive form later on if you give these nationalisms a chance to develop. There is still a similar idea that the nation should be regenerated during this time of victimhood or degeneration of the nation, that you can see that in other anti-colonial nationalisms as well. And just like in Korea, other anti-colonial nationalisms had the similar impulse towards emphasizing national unity in a time of crisis. So there was that collectivistic orientation present in many of these. And if we think about the history of imperialism, most colonies were colonized by Western powers. Japan was the lone non-Western colonial power in this age of imperialism in the 19th and 20th century. So most colonies had a very deep resentment against Western forms of modernity. So they were enamored by features of modernity like technology and so forth, but they did not want to emulate the Western capitalist model that had victimized them, right? It was through this capitalist system that these European powers were seeking markets and resources that pushed them to colonize other parts of the world. So one response, of course, is to turn to socialism and find inspiration in the Russian Revolution. But there were still some nationalist activists around the world that still were hesitant to embrace Marxism and communism, but still wanted an alternative to Western modernity and capitalist modernity. And so they turned to fascism. And there's historical research talking about how nationalists in India and Burma and China, which is semi-colonial, or semi-colonized, you could say, that turned to fascism as inspirations. And you also have research talking about how the Nazis actually cultivated relations with anti-colonial activists during World War II. You have these connections to fascism from not just Korean but other anti-colonial nationalisms. So I think in that case, Korea fits this general trend of at least certain segments of anti-colonial nationalist activists turning to fascism. But it's Korea, but the defining feature of Korea is that it's post-colonial. Right? Even after World War II, which was defined as a war against fascism, even after fascism was defeated in this war against fascism, you had Koreans still embracing what we might identify as fascist ideas. And here, I think we can show that whatever the historical context, even a nationalism like Korea's anti-colonial nationalism has the potential to turn fascist. Fascist ideas have this appeal across time and space. Even an anti-colonial nationalism can turn fascism. Every nationalism has this fascist potential. Maybe I can borrow from Lenin and talk about fascism as the highest stage of nationalism. It's this danger that lurks in any nationalist movement, whatever its origins and characteristics, that we have to be wary of. So that's one thing. Well, one significance, I think, of Korea as a post-colonial case of fascism that we need to pay attention to. But I also want to talk about how this phenomenon of Korean fascism relates to Korean history. What is significant about it? And I think it's an expression of Koreans' liminal position caught between their post-colonial identities and their Cold War identity. So, of course, during the Cold War, the Koreans were well ensconced in the American orbit. And a couple of years ago in 2023, there are many celebrations across the United States, across college campuses, celebrating the 70th anniversary of Korea's alliance with the United States, concluded in 1953. And most Koreans, I think, have very friendly feelings towards the United States. That is undeniable. At the same time, there were many disagreements with how American hegemony should be exercised in Korea, but also whether American culture and civilization were role models for Korea. And this is where fascism, I think, this is why fascistic ideas became popular, is the struggle among Koreans to reconcile their discomfort at being in the American orbit, but still being in the American orbit. So it's this sort of post-colonial sense. You had Koreans expressing a lot of sympathy towards other post-colonial nation states during this time. Their nationalism they had convergences with other post-colonial nationalisms. If you look at the ideas being propagated, like even in Indonesia under Sukarno, you can find certain convergences there. But it's also the fact that you had the colonial legacies still, showing strength in post-colonial discourse, right? Those anti-Western ideas from Japan still playing out in Korean discourse. So it's that post-colonial aspect of Korean post-1945 identity clashing with their Cold War commitments with the United States. One expression of that, I'm arguing, is fascism. And I think that's why it's also significant to study fascism in the context of Korean history. So that's another argument I'm making. But I could go on and on about this, but I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions. But just thank you for your time. Just thank you so much.